Have you ever wondered if love for life can survive after everything is taken from you? People whisper that at 60, dreams belong to the past and joy fades like old paint on forgotten walls. But I am here, breathing proof that they are wrong. I have seen my world collapse. I have walked through corridors of loneliness where even hope seemed absent. And yet today, in this very moment, I love life more fiercely than I ever did in my youth. This is not because my life was easy, but because every scar I carry taught me how precious it is simply to keep going. Asterisk I was born in 1965 in Ohio, in a modest neighborhood that smelled of steel factories, wet earth, and Sunday suppers that somehow stretched to feed families of 6. The winters were harsh, the summers sticky with humidity, and the sidewalks cracked under the weight of lives that were never quite secure. My father worked in a local manufacturing plant, his hands forever lined with grease and tiny cuts. My mother worked at a diner, always on her feet, always smiling at customers while carrying the exhaustion of a woman who never had enough hours in her day. We were middle class. Though the word middle often felt like a cruel joke. Rent was paid, but always on the last possible day. The car broke down more often than it ran smoothly. Hand-me-down clothes filled my closet. Yet we had each other, and in the evenings, when my father sat at the table repairing something that had broken and my mother hummed while folding laundry, I felt a strange kind of safety. Even as a little girl, I loved color. I would sit with scraps of fabric my grandmother gave me, pressing them into shapes, imagining what they could become. My first love was painting. I would save every penny to buy brushes and small sets of watercolor paints from the corner store. The first time I placed paint on paper, the world felt like it shifted slightly, as if telling me, "This is who you are." But in Ohio, in a working-class family, art was never considered a real path. It was a hobby at best, a waste of time at worst. Still, I painted. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I would sit by the small lamp in my room, filling sketchbooks with images of trees, rivers, and the faces of people I loved. By the time I finished high school, my dreams of art school had already collided with the walls of reality. We had no money for college, and scholarships were for children who stood out in ways I never had the chance to. My parents gently but firmly told me to find work, something steady, something that paid bills. And so I folded away my sketches, tucked the brushes in a showbox, and took a job at a local department store. It was there, at 19, that I met David. He was charming, confident, a man who knew how to make a girl feel seen. He came from a family a little better off than mine. His father owned a small business, his mother stayed home. David liked to talk about the future, about houses with yards and cars that didn't need constant repairs. He looked at me like I was someone who deserved more than second-hand dresses and late-night shifts. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that maybe through him I could finally live the dream of stability, even if it wasn't the dream of art I had once clung to. We married when I was 21. The wedding was simple, a rented hall, folding chairs, a cake baked by my aunt. But I remember the way my father cried when he walked me down the aisle, his rough hands trembling, and the way David promised me, in front of everyone, that he would never let me down. I believed those words like gospel. The early years of marriage were filled with the kind of small struggles you expect. We lived in a modest apartment near downtown, the walls thin enough that we could hear our neighbors fighting or laughing late into the night. Money was always tight, but we were young, and every Friday night pizza felt like celebration. I worked as a secretary in an insurance office, typing letters and answering phones, while David worked long shifts in sales. He was ambitious, always talking about promotions, always chasing more. When our first child, Mark, was born, I felt the world tilt in a way I had never known before. Holding him, tiny and fragile, I understood love as something larger than anything I had painted or imagined. 2 years later, Anne arrived, and then finally, in my early 30s, we had Claire. 3 children, one after another, each bringing both joy and exhaustion. My days blurred into diapers, school lunches, late-night fevers, and endless laundry. David worked longer hours, often gone before the children woke, and returning after they were asleep. There were moments I tried to hold onto myself. Sometimes I would take out the showbox of paints and quietly work on a canvas after the kids went to bed. But most nights, I was too tired. My art became like a secret friend I had left behind, someone I thought I might call one day, but never quite did. As the years went by, something in David shifted. He became more distant, more critical. Nothing was ever enough: the dinners I cooked, the way the children behaved, the small paycheck I brought in. He controlled the finances, made the decisions, and I grew smaller in my own home. I told myself it was just marriage, just stress, just the way men could be. But deep inside, a loneliness spread like a quiet illness. By the time I turned 40, that loneliness had become unbearable. The man who once promised me the world had turned into someone I could barely recognize. His ambition had hardened into arrogance, his attention into indifference. He left one night after an argument that felt no different from 100 others, except this time he didn't come back. The divorce papers followed like a cold wind, final and merciless. I thought the worst was over, but it was only the beginning. The financial collapse came next. Bills piled high, the house was too expensive to keep, and I found myself working 2 jobs just to cover food and rent. My health faltered too. It began with fatigue I couldn't explain, then tests. Then doctors whispering about suspicious cells and surgery. I remember sitting in the sterile white room, hearing the word cancer and feeling the world narrow into a tunnel. I thought, is this how it ends? Alone, broke, and sick. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, listening to the quiet house, wondering if my children would be okay, wondering if I had failed them in ways I couldn't repair. There were mornings I could barely drag myself out of bed, yet I forced myself to move, to breathe, to show up. The world expected nothing from me anymore, but I still had 3 children watching, and I could not let despair be the only thing they inherited. And yet, in those darkest hours, something inside me whispered that I was not finished. That small voice reminded me of the girl who once painted by the light of a cheap lamp, who believed color could change the way the world felt. That whisper would become my lifeline. Though I didn't know it then, I don't know what pushed me to open that old showbox again. Maybe it was the silence in the house after the children had fallen asleep. Or maybe it was the memory of my grandmother's voice telling me, your hands can always make something out of nothing, whatever it was. One night I pulled it from the back of the closet and set it on the kitchen table. Inside were the brushes, stiff with neglect, and the cracked tubes of paint I hadn't touched in years. I squeezed one, and to my surprise, color still bled out. It felt like a pulse, faint but alive. I began slowly, almost clumsily, painting scraps of cardboard because I couldn't afford proper canvases. At first the lines were shaky, the colors too harsh, but the act itself was a release. Hours slipped by unnoticed as I watched shapes form again under my hands. It wasn't about art school dreams anymore. It was survival, a way to prove to myself that I hadn't disappeared entirely. When Anna wandered into the kitchen one evening and saw me bent over the table, she asked, "Mom, are you making something?" Her little voice startled me. For a moment I thought of hiding the brush, embarrassed, but instead I said, "Yes, sweetheart, I'm making something just for me." She smiled and nodded like she understood more than her years allowed. That tiny exchange lit something inside me. Painting turned into a nightly ritual. I would work long days at the office and the diner, come home exhausted, feed the children, clean, and then, when the house finally quieted, I would paint. My hands ached, my back screamed, but my heart finally felt awake. It was Mark, my eldest, who first suggested that I show my work. He was 15 then, tall and restless, and one day he came home with a flyer for a community fair. "They have stalls for crafts and stuff," he said casually, sliding it across the table. "You should go, Mom, people would like your paintings," I laughed, dismissing the idea. Who would want the shaky colours of a woman who had barely kept her life from falling apart? But the thought wouldn't leave me. The day of the fair, I packed 3 small canvases into a tote bag and set up a folding chair in the corner of the gymnasium that smelled of popcorn and floor polish. My booth was nothing compared to the others' tables stacked with jewellery, polished woodwork, bright quilts. I felt small, exposed, ridiculous. Then a woman stopped, studied my painting of an Ohio autumn street, and said softly, "It feels like home. She bought it for $20. My hands trembled as I accepted the bill. It was more than money, it was validation, a reminder that what came from me could still mean something. From then on, weekends turned into small shows and local markets. I sold more pieces, sometimes for a few dollars, sometimes just enough to cover the cost of supplies. Each sale was a victory, each conversation a reminder that I was still part of the world. People told me their stories as they studied my work, stories of loss, of resilience, of finding beauty where it shouldn't have existed. Listening to them, I realized we were all carrying fragments of broken lives, and maybe art was one way of stitching them together. Slowly, my children began to see me differently. I wasn't just the mother who worked double shifts and came home with swollen feet. I was someone creating again, someone who smiled differently when she painted, someone who had a spark they thought was gone. Anna began helping me arrange displays, Claire sat beside me mixing colours, and even Mark, who pretended to be indifferent, once brought his friends to see my stall. That pride in their eyes became the strongest medicine I had ever tasted. The money didn't solve everything. Bills still piled up, medical expenses still haunted me, and I still woke some nights afraid of what another test result might bring. But for the first time in years, my life wasn't only about fear, it was about possibility. The colours on my canvases bled into the way I lived, reminding me that nothing stayed black and white forever. The turning point came when a woman from the local community centre visited one of my stalls. She watched me painting a small canvas as I waited for customers, and then she asked, "Would you consider teaching?" "We've been looking for someone to run a weekend workshop." I nearly laughed in her face. Me, a teacher. I wasn't trained, I wasn't professional. But she insisted, telling me she had seen enough in my work to believe I could inspire others. Against every doubt I carried, I said yes. The first class was terrifying. 10 women sat in a circle, staring at me, waiting for guidance. My hands shook as I held up a brush and explained how to blend colors, how to let mistakes become part of the design. But as the hours passed, something shifted. The women laughed, shared stories, compared messy canvases, and thanked me for showing them how to let go. I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in decades. Teaching became a part of me. It wasn't about income, it was about connection. Each class filled me with the reminder that healing wasn't something you did alone. In those sessions, surrounded by women painting away their fears and frustrations, I healed alongside them. And so the idea of a studio was born. At first, it was just a dream, a whispered thought I hardly dared to voice. But with each fair, each class, each sale, the dream grew louder. A year later, with savings scraped from extra shifts and market sales, I signed a lease for a tiny space on a quiet street in the heart of town. It had peeling wallpaper, a leaky faucet, and barely enough room for 6 tables, but to me, it felt like a cathedral. When I unlocked the door for the first time, I stood in the empty room and whispered, "This is mine." I painted the walls bright, hung my work where the plaster cracked, and placed jars of brushes on the shelves like offerings. The sign outside was simple, Linda's Studio. The letters were uneven, painted by my own hand, but they were honest. Walking into that space each morning, I felt like I was reclaiming not just a room, but the part of myself I thought had died years before. And in those walls, surrounded by colour, I began to fall in love with life all over again. The studio became more than for walls and brushes. It turned into a place where people came not only to paint, but to breathe. Mothers escaping long weeks, teenagers searching for an outlet, retirees rediscovering passions they had set aside for decades. They all came through that door, and each left a little lighter. I didn't teach them how to be artists. I taught them how to forgive themselves for imperfection, how to keep showing up to the canvas even when they didn't know where the picture was going. And somewhere in that process, I realized I was teaching myself too. There were still nights when fear whispered. My health wasn't perfect. The shadow of that cancer scare never fully left. I went for checkups with a mix of dread and defiance, clutching my children's photos in my wallet like armor. The memory of those hospital rooms had etched itself into me. But standing in the studio, watching a room full of people laughing at spilled paint, I felt stronger than the fear. Mark, my eldest, grew into a man with a quiet steadiness that reminded me of my father. He chose to stay close, working in construction and helping me with the heavy lifting the studio demanded. There were days when he would appear at the door after work, dust in his hair, and fix shelves or replace a broken light without me asking. When I thanked him, he shrugged and said, "This place helped you. It deserves to stand." I knew, without him saying, that he was proud. Claire, always the curious one, became a teacher herself. She would bring her students to the studio once a month for art days, and I watched with wonder as she guided children with the same patience I once used on her. To see my daughter standing in front of a classroom, her voice clear, her smile warm, was proof that resilience doesn't just survive, it multiplies. And Anna, my youngest, grew into a woman who chased her dreams with a courage I hadn't known at her age. She worked in healthcare, long hours that left her drained, but she still showed up at the studio with fresh flowers or snacks, filling the space with the brightness that had always lived inside her. She once told me, "Mom, this studio taught me that healing isn't just medicine. It's also beauty." I carried those words with me like a talisman. The years moved quickly. The studio expanded, not in size but in heart. People returned again and again, some for the art, some just for the company. I watched friendships blossom between women who had once been strangers. I saw tears fall over canvases that turned into laughter by the end of class. In their stories, I found pieces of my own, stitched back into place. By the time I turned 60, the studio had become a second home. On my birthday, my children and a small army of former students surprised me there. They filled the space with balloons, banners, and canvases painted with words instead of pictures. Each canvas had a single phrase: strength, hope, love, survival. I walked around the room, touching each one, my throat thick with tears. As I stood in the center of that room, surrounded by the hum of laughter and clinking glasses, I realized something I had never dared to believe before. I hadn't just survived my life, I had built it. Divorce hadn't ended me. Illness hadn't erased me. Loneliness hadn't silenced me. I had taken each broken piece and turned it into color, into texture, into something that breathed again. Later that night, when the noise had faded and the studio was quiet, I sat alone with the lights dimmed, the smell of paint and wood and old books wrapped around me. I thought of the little girl I once was, sleeping in a narrow bed, dreaming of a bigger world. I thought of the young woman who had loved and lost, who had stood in kitchens full of unpaid bills and wondered if she'd ever smile again. And I thought of the woman I had become, lined, grey-haired but standing. Still standing. If someone asked me now what success is, I wouldn't point to money or titles. I would point to these walls, to the children who grew into good people, to the faces of students who found joy here. I would point to myself, a woman who loved life even when it gave her every reason not to, Life did not give me the story I imagined. It gave me one that was harder, messier, but also richer. And at 60, sitting in my studio with brushes drying in the sink and the echo of laughter in the air, I know this, I did not lose. I won in the only way that matters. I found a way to love life, and I never stopped.